Maybe the best way into it is thinking about kind of like the framing of a digital work environment. Because there's a model that we all have in our minds of a work environment, back when people used to go to offices, a physical, very hands-on, kind of tangible place where you can feel the culture and you can work closely with others, and there's some real-time feedback that lets you know you're on the right track, and that's the other people around you. And that really exists in a digital work environment as well, and I think it always has. The emphasis there is getting stronger, though, as we turn to working mostly in our digital environments. So I always think of a digital work environment first, and then within that, when we're building the bits and pieces that make up that digital work environment, which is invariably software, I think about necessary complexity and unnecessary complexity.
This is the Play Your Position podcast, where we huddle up, call the plays, and inspire you to run your ball into the end zone. Are you ready to score more game-winning touchdowns in your life, business, and career? Then listen up, because it's game time, baby. Now, here's your host, Mary Lou Kaiser.
Hello, Team PYP. Mary Lou Kaiser here. Welcome to another episode of the Play Your Position podcast. Today is Conversation Day here at PYP, and I'm excited because my guest is a very interesting man who is doing really important work in the world. I think you're going to get a lot out of what he shares with us today. His name is Ian Robinson, and he's coming to us from St. Louis, Missouri. Ian, are you ready for kickoff?
Absolutely.
All right. So team, here are some things I know about Ian. For professional services firms dependent on expert workers and specialized software systems, increasing day-to-day productivity has become a foundational conversation. As a software developer with experience in enterprise consulting, digital marketing, and SaaS product teams, Ian Robinson has developed a unique conversational approach to fostering productivity. By reframing the role of custom software from tactical tool to a continuous means of cultivating organizational expertise, Ian aims to give employees better days and professional services firms a solid platform for sustainable growth. And Ian, like we were talking about in the pre-chat, the work you do is very interesting. And I know it's a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. But before we get into the details of your day-to-day, would you tell us about when you got the call to leadership? How old were you and what was happening in your life at the time as you remember it?
Yeah, so thank you. The way I'd kind of frame that, I probably first heard the call fairly early on in my career to do things a bit differently. And maybe when I first heard that call to leadership, I kind of tried to ignore it. And
fair enough.
I don't want the responsibility that comes with it necessarily, or I didn't in the beginning. But it got a little bit louder and louder over time as I kind of grew in my professional role. That my default kind of way of being is I show up and observe. And I'm watching very closely. I'm watching everybody, everything, listening, trying to gather everything. And then I ask questions and I try to then be of use and really introduce as little overhead as possible myself into the equation there. And, I do that. And eventually I was like, I think I need to be speaking up more. I think I need to be leading people through some of these situations because I can see maybe an easier way. So, yeah. And I'd say I'm still a little bit of a reluctant leader, though I have grown into it. My business just turned 10 this year. So I've been doing it for a little while.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you.
I find it interesting that you have the ability to articulate that you're an observer. Recent episode that just published, we're recording this in October, and at the end of September, I dropped an episode with a man who also talks about how important observing is and how the world needs more observers to do what you just described. I loved how you said, I'm watching, I'm taking everything in, and then you're the probably the wise insight contributor. We need all kinds of people in organizations. We need the ones who are more extroverted and showmen or show women, and then we need people like you who are perhaps more reserved, more quiet, but very actively taking in the scene. And is that what drew you to becoming a software developer? And I'm interested too in how you transitioned from being a software developer, which is a subject matter expert, to owning a company, which is a completely different role.
Yeah. And I kind of came into software in a strange, well, I think it's a little strange, at least, in a strange way, in that, so I'm just turned 40 recently. So I, in the 90s, was a teenager and lived in a rural area, and kind of the internet really provided, and computers in general, building some websites and stuff, really provided me with a way to connect to the world in a way that wasn't available to me otherwise. I really had a small community and nobody really around. So I actually spent a lot of time on computers, really not because I thought they were amazing, but because it provided kind of a connection to the wider world in a way that I just didn't have otherwise. And when I showed up to go to school, I kind of just picked a computer science degree because it felt like the thing I was supposed to do. I wasn't honestly that excited about it. I couldn't imagine, as a very kind of active, outdoorsy person, I could not imagine sitting at a desk all day long, which is, of course, what computer programmers do. But I did stick with it. And, once I got my first programming job, I really did enjoy the work. But I found out that, wow, this is actually all about people. And it is much more interactive on a different level than I thought it would be. Of course, so the early part of my career was, I think, letting that really emerge and sink in while I focused on the technical portions, like the actual disciplines of software development. And those things still, the technical stuff still interests me a great deal, but it's never been a priority for me or more interesting than, what it's in service of. And to me, that's always just trying to improve the day-to-day situation of the people that I'm serving.
Right. So talk more about that. In your intro that I shared, one of your main areas of focus is increasing day-to-day productivity as a foundational conversation to how an organization functions.
Yeah.
As an observer, as somebody who has been immersed in really since the early days of the internet, you are, I think, one of a very fortunate group of people because you were coming of age when the internet showed up. If you were a teenager in the 90s, now I was teaching high school in the 90s, and I remember, I just wrote about this. I remember watching my students all gathered around these clunky things called laptops, which was a new thing. And they were so enamored with what was on the screen, and it wasn't Pong, and it wasn't some of these very archaic computer games. It was the internet. And so here you are, just turned 40, and you've lived and breathed these immense changes as a young man now to a more, maturing man. That conversation piece is really interesting. And you use the words too, that these complex systems, we don't need to make them harder than they are. So talk talk to listeners about making this world of just technology everywhere easier for us to navigate.
Yeah. And I think about a lot of things. So let's see if I can get it organized. Maybe the best way into it is thinking about, I kind of like the framing of a digital work environment. And there's a model that we all have in our minds of a work environment, back when people used to go to offices, a physical, very hands-on, kind of tangible place where you can feel the culture and you can work closely with others, and there's some real-time feedback that lets you know you're on the right track, and that's the other people around you. And that really exists in a digital work environment as well. And I think it always has. The emphasis there is getting stronger, though, as we turn to working mostly in our digital environments. So I always think of a digital work environment first. And then within that, when we're building the bits and pieces that make up that digital work environment, which is invariably software, I think about necessary complexity and unnecessary complexity. And to really tease obviously we want to handle necessary complexity really well, and minimize unnecessary complexity as much as possible. And I love to just think about actually, just like an architect would, and designers coming in to build a physical space, they'd think about the culture. They'd think about the people, the size, the scope, the domain they're in, the industry. And they would make a lot of decisions that maybe would be easy to take for granted because you just show up and the space feels nice, and it works for you. And that's a similar approach that I would take to thinking about a digital work environment, where you're really trying to model that some intangible stuff into the really practical software. So you want it to be informed by values, their culture, the expert skills, and the specific skills that people have learned, and overall create this environment I think of as an expert environment, right? Where expertise is really all of those things coming together well, like values, culture, skills, to help transform a particular environment. So yeah, that's probably the way into the conversation there.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's so fascinating the way you articulate this. What does an effective digital work environment look and feel like?
Yeah. So there's this quote from an architect that I wasn't really otherwise familiar with, but I read an article, and it wasn't even a pull quote. And like the main point of the article, it was just kind of a piece there, but it really stood out to me. And he says, when thinking about architecture, the key question in architecture is how to design a space that feels reassuring on at least an unconscious level. I love that because, again, we all know what it's like to be in a space that feels consciously like not reassuring. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not supposed to be here, right? This place doesn't want me here. I think of brutalist architecture, or maybe even just waiting rooms. They're meant to be left, right? They're not really meant to be occupied. But so whenever I think about what a good digital work environment looks like, it's taking the model that this organization has, and it's trying to take all the practical stuff, their tools, processes, patterns. There's always a bunch of data involved in workflow. So it's trying to get that stuff right, which is a big act in and of itself. But then the kind of invisible details that maybe people will take for granted is just that it needs to be kind of produced in a way that is very directly accessible to people and feels welcoming. And to me, that's why I live in the custom software world, because digital work environments are going to be composed of software products, things that are developed and used by many businesses, and then custom software, which is business or software that's specific to your environment. And, there's a greatest strength, greatest weakness thing going on there too, where because it's software that's built just for a single environment, if you do it really well, then it captures the spirit of that environment and it's more directly accessible because, not only are the tools there that you need and they're functional, but it's in your vocabulary. It's using your colors. It's using, it knows your role in the organization and speaks to you in that way. And, I think that kind of work is really underappreciated and maybe undervalued, because if you think about it, it doesn't seem that important when you're really focused on, just hard kind of technology stuff or hard business goals. But what we have to remember is that this digital work environment we're building is kind of for everybody at the company. We're learning from people in the past, we're serving people in the present, but those people will turn over and they will be other people in the future. So we're trying to build something that's kind of stable over time and accessible and captures captures the spirit of this whole project and makes it really easy to access and easy to digest and reinforces the practices and serves as a guide almost, in addition to just providing the functional tools.
Yeah, there's two big takeaways from what you just said. The first one is, I think, a very critical question leaders have to ask within their organization is, are we going to invest in a customized system that embodies the spirit of who we are? Or are we going to go with one of the templated, for lack of a better term, or cookie cutter products that are on the market? I mean, that's a decision that leaders have to make, because today companies do run on systems. So are you going to bring in something that 1,000 other companies are also using and then just tweaking it as you can within the limitations of it for your culture? Or are you going to have something built like a custom home that is truly yours and that grows with you? So that's one really important question that comes out of what you just said. And then the other one is I like how you say capturing the spirit of a place. And I know a percentage of my listeners are solopreneurs. They're running their own business, usually a service-based business. Some of them may have a product here and there, like a course, but generally speaking, service-based people. And there is such a thing as a culture of one, and figuring out what are the systems that you're going to use, you're going to choose to support your digital work environment so that you can get more of what your magic is out into the world versus being absolutely inundated with the complexity of learning. I sat down, the number of systems that a typical person now is using a day, I'm talking about digital systems, is mind-boggling.
It really is.
Isn't it? I mean, you think about, you have a smartphone. A lot of people also have a tablet, maybe have a mainframe computer or a laptop. Okay, there's that. And then within all of those hardwares are a gazillion apps, which all have their own flavor, all have their own nuances. And there's only so much our brains can process. So we default to the things that have either been around longer or we just lose ourselves on social media.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love your take on, as part of the digital work environment, social media platforms are certainly play a role in our lives today. There's LinkedIn, there's Instagram, there's TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, Snapchat. God only knows what else is out there. But these are like the big ones we see tossed around. When you work with companies, Ian, and you're sitting down with leaders and you're talking about this idea of building a customized software system that will help support their digital work environment, how do you address the existence and I guess role that social media platforms play in our daily lives?
Well, I am very fortunate to be focused almost on the other side of the the metaphorical world from social media in more of the project management operations kind of foundational work. We have done a lot over the years in kind of the digital marketing world, but the more time I spent over there, the more I wanted to go back to the more functional stuff. So the social media conversation really is fairly separate out from our client conversations.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say there's a ton of direct connection there. That said, I have lots of thoughts about social media, but I don't.
Well, we can save those for another time, because I do want to focus on the work that you do, which is on the project management side and building those systems that would help a company. Yeah. Tell us about what types of companies have you worked with? Yeah.
So, and one thing I wanted to kind of back up and say too is that when we were talking about software products or the templated stuff, I just wanted to, a thought occurred to me that those products are probably a preferred option in a lot of cases. And I think that when you have something that you could use that's already built and you can take it on with kind of lower risk, I think that that's usually a great thing to do. And then can kind of graduate to custom once the severity of everything or the scope or the scale kind of ratchets up a bit. And, one model of that, which is kind of an easy one, is something like QuickBooks, right? Like accounting departments, they have a model of looking at the world that's an industry standard model of looking at the world. And QuickBooks, with all its quirks, has captured that and modeled that reality in some detail. It's not built for your business. It's built for all businesses, right? And then, but that's okay, right? And that's fine. We could talk about the merits of QuickBooks itself versus its competitors, but the idea of those products that aren't built for your business, but they're built for businesses like yours, as being really a foundational part of the whole digital work environment. I think where it turns a little bit is, well, in most businesses, or at least the clients I work with, their accounting department isn't the seat of their competitive expertise, right? It's an area where you want experts of a certain nature, but it's not where you differentiate. So I think when I've been building software over the last many years, my favorite and the richest opportunity for custom software is when you are serving that area that is really unique to your organization and has its own model of the world. Right? So for me, that's been, it's been healthcare, it's been construction, manufacturing, all sorts of different industries. And so a healthcare example would be an auditing firm that would come in and do audits, risk assessments, and audits in a healthcare setting. So they have the industry expertise. And, that whole platform was based on the fact that they had developed their own proprietary way of working. Their their own framing, their own kind of process and approach. And it was really characterized by continuous learning. So one engagement would serve the next two, because we'd pull out of it, I say we, but they would pull out of it best practices, key observations, and different learnings. So there's this whole knowledge management component that was really, I think, it was best served by building custom, because you want to be able to bake that stuff in at a deep level. Right. So as you're conducting the project and doing an audit, a risk assessment, whatever, you're taking lots of notes, you're checking lots of boxes, and then structuring all of the data about that engagement in a way that you can learn from it more easily over time and sit back and look at a whole host. Like, here's all of the engagements from this year. We can take all of those learnings and push that knowledge back into the product and develop new features based on that. So there's this continuous kind of growth in there. And I think that was one of our earlier adventures that we were involved with for some time. But that was one of the best examples, I think, just because the feedback loop there, and it took discipline on our client's part, but the feedback loop there was very strong for kind of continuous improvement.
Mm-hmm. It's halftime here at the Play Your Position podcast, and we've got ourselves a great game. While you're up grabbing another snack and topping off your favorite beverage, make sure to subscribe to the show so you never miss another play. PYP is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever great podcasts can be found. Now, let's get back to the game.
In a way, you're building a digital partner that continues to inform the organization of what to do next based on what just happened, or what not to do next. And maybe at one time in a world before systems and technology are at the level they are today, there were people in place for that. But because of the pace of how life goes now and the need for that continuous feedback loop, I think that's fascinating that you and your team are able to build a system that becomes its own source of information. And, you're certainly working with companies with huge budgets. They're mature companies. They're not necessarily startups, although I shouldn't just assume that you've never worked with a startup. But based on what you've said so far, it sounds to me like you're working with companies who've reached a point where they realize having a custom system makes sense versus in the early days. It's kind of like a starter house versus later in life. You've worked and you've learned what you like and don't like in a home. And then you say, one day, if I could have the perfect thing, it's like that with a company. And if one day we could have a system that did X, Y, and Z, and then you come in and say, well, that is possible. We can help you do that.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And the other dynamic, because we have enough money to be able to do something like that as an organization, but there's kind of a case that almost makes itself too, when you're like, well, we need it to do something special, but we also are going to be doing this for the next 10 years, 20 years. Like it's long-lived, large-scale operations. So that's like, from the healthcare example, they'd been doing that a long time and had previous versions of the software. And, the construction example that I'm thinking of, again, they've been doing this work for a very long time, and they will plan to do this work for a very long time. So taking a couple, a year or three somewhere in the middle there to say, hey, let's really stop and regroup on this and bake everything that we've learned into it. Let go of all of the cruft that's developed, which is maybe the biggest part of a lot of the work that we do is we're also building a list of all of the things to let go of.
Yes. Oh boy.
Because things accrue over time, and people normalize the pain that goes along with it, I think.
Oh boy, dude. That's I think that's one of the golden nuggets from today. Boy, is that true. Wow.
Well, and so what that looks like too is that we normalize, hey, when we hire new people, like we kind of get used to the fact that it's going to be a pain in the ass to learn the new systems. It's going to be like, we'll let them in slowly and only show them so much at once because we don't want them to quit in the first month, right? And we normalize kind of the overhead and the workarounds and the day-to-day frustration of not really feeling empowered by our tools, but being, I don't know, just, needing to use them, but also them really not understanding the situation that we're in and how best to serve us. Not to mention, all sorts of just mistakes and inconsistencies and errors that can come about with old systems that are kind of out of touch with our expertise. And then maybe one of the other big ones is knowledge silos, right? So
those exist, really?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. And it's at multiple levels too, because sometimes it can be, well, I have no idea what the process is. Like how do we find somebody who knows this area of the business, for whatever it is? Even say a recent example, onboarding a new vendor, right?
Right.
Oh, wait, how do we actually do that? Like, who knows how to do that? Who do we talk to? But then there's actually using the software systems. Like, oh yeah, there's this one guy, this one girl that's out there that knows exactly how to, knows the secrets of the system. And when we're stuck, they'll, and sometimes that's the help desk too, where it's just like, I rely on them maybe more than I need to. But those are, I think, the sorts of that's the sort of symptoms that we see.
Wow.
That are, again, they're not enough on their own to say, hey, we need to rethink everything. But when that stuff melts away after we're able to put something kind of sane in place, it feels very different.
Yes. Well, in like any of us who are in a service providing role, there's a leap of faith that we're asking our clients to take with us because they're stepping into the unknown. They've only known it, as you said, normalizing the pain. That is how it feels. And I think of that one, I think the proper term is an allegory about the lion with the thorn in its paw and the mouse. And it's so used to having that pain in its paw and it's miserable. And people are, all the animals around it are like, basically, dude, you got to get a better attitude, figure it out, what's going on. And then the mouse comes along and sees the thorn and pulls it out. And the lion all of a sudden is like, wait a minute. I can feel this good. Right. Yep. And that's what you're delivering is that, wow, we can feel this good, that sense of it is possible for us to have a different experience. And boy, I'm curious, what are some of the pain points? You mentioned a couple, the knowledge silos, the not knowing who does this around here question. What's another couple of examples of challenges that leaders you speak with tell you about, Ian, that they're struggling with?
Yeah, I think the one, so it's really a question of what type of pain is somebody in, because
exactly.
they're when they show up. In a very recent example, it was just not having good options, period. And the barrier to entry if you're a company that has developed, your process, and you're selling work, you're getting that work done, but the manual kind of effort to keep track of your project workflows, project data, status, really just tracking all of the detailed data. And I'm thinking of one in the construction industry where they're installing electrical, doing all of the electrical for things like data centers and automotive facilities. There's a lot going on there, a lot to keep track of. And when the type of pain that particular person was in was, we have options, but none of them are good options. So I feel like I have nothing, right? So the off-the-shelf stuff didn't really meet the mark. There were legacy tools out there that could be used, but they'd firmly kind of, the technology they were wrapped up in kind of has firmly expired. And then there's manually doing it. You can get by, a lot of people get by with Excel for a long time.
Sure.
But just showing up and saying, well, there's really not a lot of good options for me off the shelf. And I'm having trouble finding somebody who can kind of navigate the domain complexity of it too. So I think that's a big one.
Wow.
And there's all sorts of pain that people can show up in. The one I mentioned earlier was the healthcare auditing project. We actually got brought in mid-project on that one because a team had started building the software and it was very functional, but the product owner realized, 3/4 of the way through, like, nobody's going to use this. It is not accessible. This isn't his word, it's mine, but it's not humane.
Right.
And so we were brought in because we can see both sides, the technical functional part and the human portion, and really marry those two. And we're able to get the product out the door in a way that people who didn't like to use the version before were very skeptical about the new version. And it was very well received, just because we were able to come in and kind of retain the functionality underneath, but actually make it something that people would and could use.
Yeah. Well, you realize that's one of your superpowers, right?
Right.
I mean, seriously, that is an extremely rare ability to have the insight on both sides, the human side in terms of user experience and accessibility, and then the technical side of actually building this thing. So A, it does what it says it, what you're promising it's going to deliver, and B, it does it well and doesn't break. That is not easy, Ian.
Well, I have to say, it's very satisfying.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yes. Oh, I'd be doing the happy dance all the time. When on launch day, when you see how it's received, and that you played a role in making their lives better. That's the intangible reward of leadership. It really is.
It's so funny too, because I always feel like what I do and what we do, so I have a wonderful team, is, I don't know, on one hand, personally, I feel like it's amazing and the best thing ever. And on the other hand, like, we're serving very boring businesses and we're doing very obvious things. So I feel like, well, what makes us special at all? Like, yeah, we make software that works and also makes people feel better. For boring esoteric industries. And it's like, well, Yeah.
Those industries, though, are the backbone of this country and the world, you could argue. I mean, healthcare, construction, manufacturing, we all depend on those daily. And yeah, they're not maybe the cool, sexy things that are broadcast across, going back to social media. You're not going to find the manufacturing influencer.
Well, and there's where you get back into my feelings about social media, which is, we are having the wrong conversation.
We sure are. Oh boy, are we ever. Thank you for saying that out loud. Oh my goodness.
And actually saying conversation again made me think of, one of the things that I've not delivered on that you read in my little intro was this conversational nature of the products. And I do have kind of 5 conversations. They're very, very high level and obvious maybe. But when we're thinking about, so folks in leadership at these types of organizations are really trying to think about productivity. And we tend not to address that directly because, it's more indirect. I guess in some sense we do address it directly because people need to get A, B, and C done. So we build those tools. But the bigger kind of framing around it is, well, if people have those tools and they feel kind of seen and heard, then, they're more in the flow of things. That productivity falls out as a side effect. It's not necessarily we're going to really be able to move these specific productivity metrics, at least at first. So when we're framing out how the endeavor of building a new software platform, I think of it as we're going to build as little as possible to be successful now. So in software, I like to call it V now and V next, V beyond. I don't know.
Nice, yeah.
But when we're thinking about how do we build as little as possible now, there's a lot of different levels to it. And anyway, so the first kind of conversation, I think, really goes all the way back to identity, and who are we and who do we want to be? And I think this is where people's values and culture should be highlighted and really brought to the forefront. And so if you're an organization that really defines itself in a certain way, let's get that out there. And if they're trying to change the world in a certain way, let's get that out there. And so that first conversation is really anchoring and grounding ourselves in identity. The second one is kind of more about risk. So why are we taking action here? Like what exactly is at stake if we don't do this now? If we don't build our own, kind of proprietary tools in my case. And a lot of times it's like, well, we're not going to be who we want to be. Going back to the identity thing, like this needs, right. So you need to connect those dots and say, and really be able to say, we're doing this because the risk of not doing it is greater to us just being who we want to be in the world, and especially over time. And that the third conversation is really getting more specific about what success looks like and how does it look and feel for people. So I'd call this maybe outcomes. Right? Mm-hmm. How does it look and feel for people once we get this new kind of digital work environment, new anchor component potentially of our digital work environment up and running? And being specific, going through roles and what are roles and responsibilities and how do we empower them? So the outcomes are always around how empowered different people are. Right?
Yes.
And then the next one I'd say is really slicing it down to say, what is the foundation? And so the foundation is what needs to be built first, because the rest naturally needs to go on top of it. So a lot of times the foundation, back to one of the things we were talking about earlier, is not only the stuff that's worked for us for a long time, but it's so the practices that we've proven out through manual means or by using off-the-shelf products, we want to really clean that up and bake it into the foundation of this new thing. But we also want to let go of as much as possible that's, was a product of different people, different time, different place, or things that we're carrying along just because we've been carrying it for a long time.
Because it's familiar.
Because it's familiar.
It's that normalized pain.
Yeah, actually, it's invisible.
Yeah.
And that's, I think our job is easier sometimes as outsiders. So we drop into organizations and we can see all the stuff that's invisible to them. So, and then we want the foundation to be the part that's really more opinionated and is intended to last longer too. So in the foundation, I always think of it as we really don't want to build anything speculative, which is a little anticlimactic a lot of times. Like we're only building the things that and I should say only, roughly, right? Sometimes there's room for speculation around the edges, but the focus is really on stability, predictability, and this is, you don't want to build something you're working and then work backwards from it. You want to be able to move forward on top.
Mm-hmm.
So that the fifth conversation is really once you have that foundation under place. I sometimes call it growth. And I also just think of it as adapting to, though, where it's, kind of like the healthcare example I gave earlier. Well, you want to be able to reflect on how things are going by looking at the foundation that you built and how that's been going over time and kind of have a good feedback loop there. But then you're also looking in the wider world for just opportunities. Once everybody's speaking the same language and using the same tools and kind of in the flow of things, well, what's next? What are we curious about? What opportunities, in the space that's been created, because hopefully we've freed people up to actually do their jobs better and there's a little bit more space. In that space that we've created, what opportunities can people now see because they have the bandwidth to, right? Or they're standing on the stronger foundation so they can see new opportunities for improvement. And how can we take those, collect that feedback, those ideas, and kind of put them into our growth plan.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think nothing ever is really static. And, revisiting, even after you're in a growth phase for years, revisiting the identity conversation back at the beginning is, and still maybe it's more iterative there, you're not starting over with your platform, but really all of these conversations are ongoing.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I think it's a powerful way to think about something that is going to serve the heart of an organization over time, over a long period of time.
Definitely. Well, those 5 conversations could be applied to, again, a business of one.
Absolutely.
Certainly, filter through. So, team, I would encourage you to go back and re-listen to what Ian just said, because brilliant, absolute gold mine of a process that anybody could use when looking at the work that you're, wanting to put out in the world. And for people who'd like to learn more about you, Ian, where do you hang out online?
I am attempting to hang out on LinkedIn.
That's a good place.
And so, I can be found there.
Okay. And team, that links to connect with Ian will be on his show notes page over at pyppodcast.com, where you can click those links and learn more about him and his company and what he does, get into his world. This has been a really fascinating and rich conversation for me today. I'm just, again, my brain is on fire in a good way. And I thank you for that. And before we say goodbye, Ian, could you share with us a book that has been a key player on your leadership journey?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you about a book called Consolations by a man named David White.
Oh, I know. Okay, talk about it.
Well, it is, so David White is a poet, and this is not poetry. Though it is dense, it is essays. So the subtitle is The Solace, Nourishment, and Underlying Meaning of Everyday Words. And I just think that David has a wonderful way of looking at the world, and he is able to take all of these words, so alone, ambition, anger, beauty, beginning, besieged, and there's a few dozen more, and write these essays that are just wonderful, wonderful frames for how to think about yourself in the world. And the word consolation, something being consoling, comes with some connotations of maybe grief or discomfort or whatever. And the effect that the book has on you is well, I'd say it's very helpful.
Yes.
And it is very uplifting. It is while it does tackle some, bigger topics, it is, I would say, very uplifting. So that's that, and he also talks about the conversational nature of reality quite a bit, and just conversations. And so I highly recommend that one. And it's helped me, maybe check out the one on ambition, the essay there. It has really informed my kind of entrepreneurial spirit in the last couple of years when I was regrouping during the pandemic.
Sure, right. As we all did.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Ian, thank you for sharing that book. David White is one of my favorite living poets. I absolutely love his poetry. I've not heard of this book, so I'm going to add it to my personal library because like I said, I just absolutely love I've listened to some interviews he's done, and he really is one of our living sages, and it's brilliant. So great recommendation. And team, though, of course, there'll be a link to get this book on Ian's show notes page because I can tell it's powerful. And
well, I'm very excited for you if you're a fan of David's and haven't read this one. So
I have not. So wow, what an amazing conversation today, Ian. Thank you so much for sharing an hour of your time and the insights that you provided to me and Team PYP. Everything you shared today is useful, helpful on our journeys. And I wish you all the best as you continue to grow yourself and your company.
Well, thanks so much, Mary Lou. I really appreciate it. Thank you for creating the space to have the conversation.
Hey team, Mary Lou here. Who's number one in football changes from year to year. Fashion trends come and go, same with musical tastes. But leadership skills, they never go out of style. In fact, these days, leadership is an essential survival skill for a world that demands more from us than ever before. To succeed these days, you need to know how to show up for yourself so that you can then do the work you love with people you like the way you want. The Play Your Position Leadership Playbook helps you do this, and it's free. Go to pyppodcast.com to download your copy today. If being more successful this year, next year, in the 21st century is on your to-do list, get your copy of the Play Your Position Leadership Playbook now. pyppodcast.com. It's at the top of the page. You can't miss it. That's pyppodcast.com, and start being more of the leader you are meant to be today. This podcast was produced by Daniel Romeros. Show notes for this episode can be found over at pyppodcast.com. I'm Mary Lou Kaiser. Thanks for listening.
Here at the Play Your Position podcast, we believe that the road to self-mastery and a life well lived starts with answering the call to leadership. That's when the fun really begins. Send this episode to any friends who might need to hear the inspiration and ideas you heard today. And feel free to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform.